So wherever you're joining us from today, good morning, good afternoon. Welcome to our Solar O&M webinar. Our webinar today is a tale of two guarantees: how to optimize your solar O&M with availability and energy performance guarantees. We hope that you come away from this discussion understanding the difference in availability and performance guarantees and how they are calculated, what the responsibilities of your O&M provider should be, such as contractual considerations, and industry trends, whether it applies to your utility scale or DG projects. But before we get started, allow me to go over some logistics. In order to give each panelist enough time to cover their topics, we'd appreciate it if you would post your questions using the Q&A function to ask questions during the presentation or during the Q&A portion at the end of this program. Please use the chat feature for technical support. We'll do our best to make this as fun and engaging, but should we lose you due to bad internet connections, we'll have this available as a recording. My name is Teresa Dillon, and I serve on our business development team of O&M at Borrego, and I'll be hosting as your moderator today. Solar energy has been revolutionizing our energy infrastructure for decades, but we are now at a critical point in development where considerations need to be made for the long-term returns and implementation of standards that improve the efficiency of your PV solar assets. Today, you'll be hearing a presentation from a panel of experts on this very important subject, and I want to encourage you to consider whether guarantees are typically part of your O&M scope. If so, what do you look for? If it is not, what are you doing to mitigate your risk of downtime? I'm excited to introduce you to our experts. Speaking with us first is Bradley Hibbard, Director of O&M Engineering Services of Borrego, based out of our Lowell, Mass office, and who has been with the company since 2003. Bradley will define the difference between availability and performance guarantees. Next, we have Ian McRobbie, Vice President of the Operations of Algonquin Liberty Power, where he oversees the operations, engineering, and asset performance teams, who's joining us bringing the perspective of the asset owner. Last but not least, we'll hear from Christine Sinclair, Team Lead Solar Independent Engineering at DNV, who brings over a decade of solar experience and joins us from Toronto, Canada. I want to thank you all for joining us and being part of this discussion regarding the best strategies to improve your ROI and minimize your risks. Some things to consider as we move forward are self-performing versus third-party O&M contractors, and the distinction with regard to what O&M terms and conditions that contractors are able to agree to. What's in the details? We'd encourage you to look beneath the detailed numbers. Are there any contractual exclusions which will contribute to whether or not the O&M contractor will be incentivized to operate the facility for optimization? We have a Zoom poll, and we'd love to hear your thoughts on whether a guarantee is typically part of your O&M scope. All right, so we've got some interesting results here. 20% of you are saying yes, it is part of your O&M scope. No one's saying no, so we clearly see the value in this discussion. And yes, but not always, 50% of you. I think we'll find that after this discussion, it'll probably align with that. And 30% that I don't know. I'd love to see those answers change by the end of this discussion. So we'll keep moving right along. So moving along to our session, please welcome Bradley Hibbard. Bradley will be speaking to us on what are availability and energy performance guarantees. Welcome, Bradley.
Thank you, Teresa. Thanks for the introduction. So just to further expand on that, I currently serve as the Director of Engineering Services, which is a group within our O&M business, which provides engineering support to our O&M team. And this currently includes performance engineering, electrical engineering, and applications engineering for our projects team. I've been in this role for about a year. In my 18-year career at Borrego, I held a variety of engineering and technology roles. And immediately prior to this, I was responsible for our performance engineering team. Before diving into the slides, I'd like to clarify that I'm speaking from the O&M perspective, but for transparency, Borrego is also a developer and an EPC of solar and storage projects. We don't necessarily perform O&M on the projects we develop and build, however. And lastly, although my perspective is a primarily distributed generation one, and at this point, I'm not considering the impact of energy storage on any of the guarantees we're discussing. Maybe next year. All right, next slide, please. So before we jump into the details here, a quick note on the calculations on the right. I haven't presented these really in a mathematical format. They're really just in a simpler written form. I think that's the sort of the easiest way to look at these. and the one that captures their intent. There are so many variations on these that individual companies have, that capture things like weighting or exclusions. And I don't think we've really got the time or the scope to get into those here. So hopefully they're clear and at a simple level there. So what is an availability guarantee? What is a performance guarantee? So typically, or maybe historically, an availability guarantee is a guarantee that the system is capable of generating power when irradiance exceeds some threshold. And that's typically measured as an inverter generating power, something greater than 0 watts, when the irradiance is in excess of some threshold, typically 50 to 100 watts per meter squared. And the calculation here you can see on the right is the number of available hours divided by the number of available and unavailable hours. And what goes into those unavailable hours is really the key to the guarantee. As you can see in the formula, this is all based around time. So this is what's historically called a time-based guarantee. And within this, each hour is treated equally, regardless of what impact might occur on the energy generation. And you can see that doesn't necessarily represent what is happening on site, and we're not really capturing the impact of performance in that fashion. And so when I introduced that guarantee, I mentioned that it was historically known as this kind of form, but we are seeing a move to either an energy or effective availability guarantee, where we're trying to capture the energy impact of when the system is unavailable much more effectively than the time-based form. And so on the right, that looks like the energy availability is the generated energy divided by the generated plus the lost energy. And as in the availability calculation of the time-based version, the unavailable hours are the key to the guarantee. In this instance, the lost energy calculation is the key to that guarantee. How is that determined? And we typically see it calculated from the peer inverters in a system. And just to sort of summarize the availability guarantee, this is not an explicit guarantee of the amount of energy a system will generate, although the energy and effective availability guarantees move in that direction a little bit. So what is a performance guarantee? It's essentially the availability guarantee we just talked about, plus a guarantee of equipment performance. These normally take the form of either a performance ratio or a performance index calculation. And one of the key elements of this is that they are adjusted for variation between the measured and modeled weather, i.e. what was modeled and what was experienced on site during the time period of the guarantee. And these are explicit guarantees of the amount of energy a system will generate. Next slide, please. So I mentioned a couple of times that there are some key details in these guarantees. And just to expand on those a little bit, there are two aspects which we really think about critically when offering a guarantee. The first is what is included and what is excluded from a guarantee. And the second is what happens financially when the system doesn't meet the guaranteed level. So in the first instance, I've broken the exclusions down into two categories. Those that there's general consensus between most parties when we're discussing these guarantees. And those are elements like force majeure, utility-caused outages, or owner-caused outages. And then there is a second category, which typically end up being negotiated on a project-by-project, or customer-by-customer basis. And those relate to delays associated with elements such as OEM service, the processing of an RMA or a warranty claim, and the delays around spare parts supply and availability. And finally, some aspects related to environmental conditions. How does snow, ice, and soiling affect the guarantee, and who's responsible for that? Secondly, if the system doesn't meet the guaranteed level, what happens? What's the compensation? And typically there's a defined rate in our contract, and that's a function of that's a defined rate, and it's typically a function of either the electricity value, the PPA rate, could be a portion of the O&M fee, or it could be some other value. And there's often a cap on the liabilities here. In addition to damages, is there an upside if the system performs really well and exceeds the guaranteed level? What is the rate relative to those damages? And how is that shared between the owner and the O&M provider? And is there a deadband between those two rates, somewhere between the lower level of the guaranteed level and the point at which any upside might be paid? Next slide, please. So the second part of my presentation, I'd like to focus a little bit on, as an O&M provider, how we think about a guarantee when we're offering or asked to offer one. And so we sort of break this down into the causes of unavailability or underperformance. And The first one here is something that ultimately is a little bit out of our control. The number of failures that are going to occur. Typically, the O&M provider isn't always involved in the project until after the design is complete, until after the equipment is selected. And while we sometimes are engaged when commissioning is occurring, most of the construction has occurred, and issues that might occur through that are out of our control. The exception to that is when an O&M provider might also be the EPC, in which case they have a hand in all of those things. So following on from the number of failures is issue identification. Can we identify an issue? Do we have a data acquisition system which clearly and concisely identifies a performance problem? And can our operations center team dispatch a technician with confidence that the truck roll is going to be worthwhile? Or is there going to need to be an engineering review of that data? And this is complicated by the fact that we're working in distributed generation and our operations center is managing thousands of sites. And so they need to be able to very quickly and clearly take information from that platform and take action. Once we've identified an issue, the next step is response time. How long does it take us to get to site? What's the travel time? How far is our site from our technician? And how many other sites is that technician responsible for? How do we prioritize this? What else is occurring when the site has an issue that needs to be addressed? Can we dispatch today? Can it be tomorrow? What's the timeline? And then lastly, if it's required, how long will it take an OEM technician to get to site? Next slide, please. Lastly, once we're at site, how long will it take us to correct the issue? And that sort of takes the form of a couple of different aspects. Firstly is troubleshooting the root cause, and that requires expertise with the project equipment. And that can be a challenging element sometimes when technicians are responsible for a large variety of equipment across a large variety of sites. Much as everyone may think that inverters and other balance of system equipment is all the same, there's a lot of different training required. There's a lot of different manuals required. There's a lot of work required to be expert in each of the pieces of equipment. And lastly, do we have authorization to perform warranty work when we are identifying that cause? We can find the cause, but can we repair that under warranty? And next part of that is spare parts availability. Once we've identified the issue, if parts are required, are they available and are they on site or on a truck? Or are they at some storage facility which may require another visit to complete the repair? All of these play into how long it takes us to correct a problem and impact availability. Lastly, when we jump into a performance guarantee, we have to consider a number of other issues. How will the module perform? Is it going to be reliable? Is the inverter going to operate at its modeled efficiency? Will it derate due to some conditions on site or some utility conditions? How aggressive or conservative is the modeling? Did it capture the shade of terrain or snow on site? And particularly for some parts of the country, how was the soiling modeled and how did the washing schedule play into that model? All of those things there play into how we consider a guarantee. Next slide, please. And lastly, just to sum up, I'd like to communicate that we are cautious and deliberate about how we offer guarantees. We evaluate each on a project by project basis. And while our preference is not to offer a guarantee, we recognize that there is a requirement for this in some instances, whether that's on a project basis or a customer basis. When we do need to offer a guarantee, we prefer to offer availability guarantees. We believe these align more closely with our core competency of identifying, responding to, and correcting issues, as opposed to a complex combination of modeling, equipment performance, soiling and washing, and construction quality. I'd like to leave you with a finding of the recently published KWH Analytics Solar Risk Assessment for 2021. One of their key findings was that project performance continues to worsen. And a couple of the key causes of that were related to module degradation, modeling, and manufacturer solvency. And we believe that the risk that poses to us emphasizes that an availability guarantee is the most appropriate form of guarantee for us to provide. And with that, I'd like to hand it over to Ian McRobbie. Welcome, Ian.
Thanks, Bradley. Good morning, good afternoon, all. So again, I'm Ian McRobbie. I'm with Liberty Power. If you can go to the next slide for me. So Algonquin Power and Utilities Corp is our parent company. And so that company is made up of two significant parts. First is a regulated utilities company where we have electric, gas, water, and wastewater utilities across Canada and the United States. There are generation assets within the regulated utility. I am part of our unregulated power producer. And so we have wind, solar, hydro, and combined cycle gas assets that total just about 2,500 megawatts of complete generation today. We do have across the various asset types for wind, solar, and hydro, we have a mix of self-performance, largely on hydro and some solar today, as well as other third-party O&M agreements with original equipment manufacturers. As far as guarantees go, we do have lots of experience for solar and wind on availability guarantees, both time-based and energy-based. And I'll talk to you a little bit more about some of the things certainly that I consider when we go into these types of agreements. Next slide, please. So really, as an owner, you need to ask yourself, what is the result that you are trying to achieve? And what are the actions or behaviors that you need your O&M provider to display or do to be able to achieve that? You need to ensure that the guarantee results in alignment between you and your O&M provider. But yes, what is the kind of response that you want for downtime and parts, services, all those sorts of things? As Bradley discussed, you can see both time-based and energy-based guarantees. I will say, in my opinion, an energy-based guarantee offers the best alignment with the owner's interest of maximizing production and reducing downtime. But of course, the devil is always in the details. And it's important to find that right balance between you and your O&M provider. When it comes to targets, what is the appropriate target to set? You want it to be achievable, but as an owner, I also want it to be a slightly uncomfortable stretch. When it comes to time-based guarantees, well, maybe I'll back up. The reason why I think energy-based guarantees are much better aligned is that in solar, it's not hard to achieve, a high result for a time-based guarantee. 95, 96, 97, maybe even 98% is very achievable from a time-based standpoint, depending on the components that you're measuring. And I'll go into that in just a little bit. As Bradley said, from an energy-based guarantee, ensuring that you have agreement on the PV-SYST model or whatever model you're going to use and those assumptions is crucially important. Also, as Bradley discussed, exclusions. And exclusions are where you are going to spend a lot of time having discussions. Especially at the early stage of contract negotiations, you will have to spend a whole bunch of time sorting this out and go into it with an understanding of what you as the owner will want. And as the owner, you're going to want as few number of exclusions as possible. And the O&M provider is probably looking for the opposite, where they want to get the most number of exclusions available to them to be able to reduce their risk. Some are easier to understand and agree to. Shading, for instance, should be clear from the model, should be clear from the development, and should be something that is somewhat easy to agree with. How will you deal with snow and weather? How do you deal with outages, downtime associated with warranty claims and other outages? Those sorts of things are what really you need to spend a bunch of time on. When it comes to warranty, a lot of it, I think, depends on whether or not your O&M provider was also your EPC constructor or the developer, or are they only providing O&M services? If they're providing you a warranty as the constructor, it probably makes some of those other discussions in terms of exclusions and those sorts of things a little bit easier to manage. If they're only providing O&M services, often success will depend on the level of control or engagement you're willing to give to the O&M company to manage those warranties on your behalf. Maybe more for time-based guarantees, but something that is important for you to consider is what level of components get included. Oftentimes, and certainly in earlier days, those guarantees would only go down to the inverter level, which I will say as an owner is not that useful. I'm always trying to push further into the components, into the array, to include as much as possible, because by that I mean if your inverter is on, but all the combiner boxes are down, or you have fuse issues or a ground fault issue, then truthfully that inverter isn't that useful. Another thing that you as an owner need to be thinking about is what other agreements do you have that need to be considered? If you have requirements with or guarantees with your off-taker or the PPA provider, that's something that you ideally want to have ensure that you have back-to-back coverage, so that if you are at risk to the off-taker, that your O&M provider is aligned with you in terms of what that risk will be. At the end of the day, I think a lot of it comes down to, what is the level of control that you're willing to give, whether it's managing spare parts, warranties, those sorts of things. Giving more control to your O&M provider can make the guarantee easier to manage, but as an owner, you just need to be ready to give up that level of control. Also, what is the level of pain, if you will, for lack of a better word, or reward that you want to give for excellent performance? Owners tend to be greedy, right? But this is going to be a long-term relationship that you're going to form, and you need to ensure that this does work for both sides. Next slide, please. So in terms of Liberty's experience with Borrego, we are actually just starting that now. We are building some community solar projects in New York State. The first project, which is pictured here, is a 4 megawatt ground mount solar facility that's about to COD very soon. We spent a lot of time with Borrego talking about all the things that I just spoke to in terms of what is the level of service that we want, whether it's a preventative, so that they're only doing a preventative maintenance, or a more comprehensive package. In the end, we went with the more comprehensive package. And the guarantee that we have, obviously, from my earlier discussions, I have a preference for energy-based guarantees. And so that's what we were going into this relationship with. So we have 5 projects in total that we're going to be partnering with Borrego on. One of those is a solar plus storage facility. And we still need to have, as Bradley indicated, there's some fine tuning that probably needs to be done around guarantees when it comes to solar plus storage, because things like utility outages no longer apply, because I could have my PV system charging the battery, even if we can't discharge energy to the grid. So more to come on that, as Bradley said. I'll now happily pass the torch over to Christine Sinclair from DNV to take you through some other industry experience.
Thanks, Ian. And hello, everyone. I'm happy to be here today. My name is Christine Sinclair. I'm with DNV, specifically in the utility scale solar independent engineering group. At DNV, we deal with O&M at different parts of the project lifecycle through our owner's engineering group in the development phase, our independent engineering group in the pre-construction and construction project financing phase, and our asset optimization and mergers and acquisition group does a lot of operations phase work. Next slide, please. So I thought I'd start off by showing a little bit of what actually happens in the field with availability. This is a sample of data across many projects in the US, specifically distributed generation in this instance. So there's a few things to unpack here. One, the median value that we're seeing for availability in this instance is 97.6%, which, although is lower than, say, a 98 or 99% availability guarantee that we would normally see, it's important to note that it's not all doom and gloom. There's a lot of projects that are performing at the 99% level, as you can see by that large spike. So a lot of projects are doing very well, and clearly it is possible to achieve that level of availability. Now, this is a one-sided distribution with a very long tail, meaning that the minority of projects are causing the majority of heartache for owners and operators. Now, there can be several reasons for this, and operations and maintenance is always a trade-off between maximizing production revenue and decreasing operations costs. So in a lot of these instances, presumably the choice is being made to maintain the projects in this state through a cost benefit relationship. Recently, NovaSource reported that availability for projects with inverters where the OEMs are no longer active have 10% absolute lower availability compared to projects that have inverters where it is easy to obtain parts and service. So that is one example of why you might see this discrepancy. Next slide, please. Here we have a survey of O&M contracts that we've seen in the utility scale space. This is a pretty comprehensive survey of 7 gigawatts of projects, and there's 19 different operations providers included in this data set. Just almost half of which includes self-performing providers. So where the O&M provider is affiliated or is under the parent company of the owner corporation of the project. So unfortunately, and fortunately, maybe this graph is somewhat boring in the sense that the majority of availabilities are at 98, 99% guarantee level contracted. And so what that means is the industry has more or less converged at this level of guarantee, agreeing that it should be possible, and it gives the strength to the O&M contract. And notably, we saw no notable difference between the self-performing and the independent third-party O&M providers in terms of the level of contracted guarantee. Now, as Ian mentioned, the devil is definitely in the details. Next slide, please. So as an independent engineer, when we're reviewing a contract, you can review it from many different perspectives. So from the owner perspective or from the operator perspective, and they may want different things, more or less exclusions, whatever the details might be. As an independent engineer, we speak on behalf of the project. So it's like the Lorax who speaks for the trees. I'm reading a lot of stories with my kids these days, but we speak on behalf of the project, and from the project's perspective, whatever aligns the incentives of the operator and owner is going to be in the best interest of the project. So looking towards that center column in this slide. Some of the things that we'll look for when we're reviewing a contract is in terms of the O&M availability guarantee, is that the guarantee is clearly defined, and including example calculations with the equation. Same with liquidated damages associated with that availability guarantee. How are they calculated? Is there an example? Is it clearly defined? We'll also look at response times and oversight. What sort of oversight control does the owner have? As Ian mentioned, looking beyond the inverter further into the array, can you see the trackers if they're on or off, if they're tracking or not? Can you see the modules and their state of DC health? Any sort of oversight that there is for the owner helps give them comfort and ability to action on the project's health. We'll look at guaranteed response times. If they're stipulated, if there's stage gated by different types of potential energy loss, and if they're clearly defined. Exclusions, as both Bradley and Ian mentioned, are very important to define. And we like to see limited exclusions that are clearly defined. If there's only a couple of exclusions and they're very kind of fuzzy in their definition, that just means there's going to be a lot of dispute later on. Similarly, if there's a long list of exclusions, typically that's not going to be too favorable for the project. We'll want to, as has been touched upon earlier, we'll want to know about spare parts. Whose responsibility is for procurement, for tracking them, is there a markup on them? Are they shared across multiple projects? Where are they stored? Are they easily accessible? Is it different if there's a warranty, or if it has to be OEM repair done, or if they're OEM, if the product is no longer available? How does that influence the spare parts management plan? We'll also want to, spare parts, liquidated damages, response times. I think I may have covered it all. In any case, it's not a clear, 99% isn't always better than 98%, say, for a guarantee. It depends what is offered in those two cases. a 98% availability guarantee that is strongly actionable, that is clearly defined, may be more favorable to the project than a 99% availability guarantee with a long list of exclusions and unclearly defined that might lead to disputes at a later date. So the devil is in the details. With that, I'll pass it back to Teresa for the Q&A.
All right. Well, that was so informative. Thank you to all three of you for enlightening us with all this great information. I'm sure many of you are still processing all of this.
Teresa, I'm not able to hear you. I'm not sure if anyone else can.
I'm speaking.
I'm
Can
good.
somebody confirm?
Yep.
Okay. All right. Perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you. And so with that said, you know, we want to go through our second Zoom poll today. Now that you've been armed with all of this information, now that we've reviewed these types of guarantees, which ones would be more applicable to your portfolio? Survey says, so for 10% of you, performance is typically more applicable to your portfolio. 30% say availability, and 60% say both, which does seem to align with a lot of what the requests that we come in, and it's all dependent on your portfolio and individual projects. So we've heard our panelists' thoughts, and now we'll take this time to answer some of your questions. You know, we've heard them tell us that the best guarantee contracts are typically favorable to both the owner and the operator. It's important to consider the level of service you want to receive. What are your expectations? And with limited exclusions that are clearly defined to reduce disputes over time. We've learned that the outcomes of these guarantees is not dependent on whether you self-perform or you contract an O&M provider, but that the thing that will be in the best interest of your projects will be based on solid spare parts management plan, response times tiered by severity, and of course, these clearly defined contract terms. So let's jump to some of the questions from our audience. So Christine, we'll jump to you on this one. What is the importance of availability guarantees during M&A transactions?
That's a good question. So when we look at the historical performance of a project for a mergers and acquisitions scenario, we'll make the basic assumption of how a project has performed historically is how it will continue to perform in the near future. So if the availability has been low, we'll assume that at least in the near term, the project will continue to perform at that level. Now, that's a first step when you're evaluating an asset. Now, when you look at the financial model and the ins and outs, has that lower availability been compensated over time by liquidated damages on the O&M contract, and to what extent? Does it cover the project for potential lost revenue? Has it been paid over time? Is it in the contract, and has it been paid? If it has been paid, great, that's a good contract. You can count on that and work that into your financial model going forwards when you're valuing the asset for what it's worth for a sale. If there is an availability guarantee, but there have been no liquidated damages paid, then that's a flag and that's a problem. And you can't count into that. And maybe that should be a bit of a derate to the project evaluation. So we definitely look at how a project has operated over time to consider its value going forward, and to look for opportunities, potential upside for the buyer to be able to improve the project.
Thank you for that. So a question for all panelists, and Bradley, we'll start with you. Do O&M service providers typically provide both an availability or performance guarantee, or just one or the other? And to add on top of that, has anyone implemented both energy and time-based availability guarantees in a single contract?
I think my answer would be that in my thinking that a performance guarantee, or I think energy availability, I think we're using those, sorry, energy guarantee, we're using those fairly interchangeably. those really incorporate availability. It's going to be difficult to achieve a performance guarantee at a reasonable level without having good availability. So you're kind of guaranteeing both. So I would say that in effect, we are guaranteeing both of those things within a single contract when we offer an energy performance guarantee. But we haven't ever offered both availability and performance guarantees as separate parts of the same contract.
Ian, to you, have you as an owner ever requested that type of guarantee where you're combining a mixture of the two in a single contract?
No, we tend to stick with, now we tend to stick with energy-based guarantees. I agree with Bradley, like it is somewhat akin to the performance guarantee, but it's maybe slightly different. It gets you, I think it gets you to a similar place that's maybe just a little bit easier to manage. We haven't tried to do both time-based and energy-based all in one agreement. You can get somewhere along that ways if you do have response time guarantees in your contract to ensure that, you know, if your site goes down or inverter goes down, that your O&M provider has to react and respond in a certain amount of time. But we've not looked to combine those. Again, I think an energy-based guarantee, in my mind, provides the best motivation to get the sorts of things that us as an owner are looking for.
That completely makes sense. Yeah, and already adding to the complexity of how we determine these ratios as well, to add the two types of guarantees into a single contract would just probably make everyone's head spin. But Christine, what are your thoughts on this?
Agreed. You want something that is easy to administer.
Mm-hmm.
And that is clearly defined what everyone's relationship is. And that might be why it's fairly common to see time-based availability guarantees. They're very simple to define and administer. Energy-based, agreed that it can be more favorable to the owner, but also agreed with Bradley that it might be easier to provide that type of guarantee if you're the O&M who did the EPC work, say, and you can take a bit more responsibility for knowing how it was built and knowing that it is going to perform over time.
Mm-hmm. And
hey, sorry, Teresa, I will add, like the idea of the performance, certainly the performance metrics are something that I know we as owners are using ourselves, right? That idea of a performance index is how internally we do manage a lot of it's one of our key KPIs, let's put it that way. Mm-hmm. And I think where it becomes a challenge in terms of using that with an O&M provider is in the exclusions, because the way that we look at it for our portfolio overall is simply, was the asset running or not running? And if it wasn't running, or if it is running, like, there are no exclusions, right? The energy that we generated versus the energy that we could have generated, right? Whatever the theoretical was based on the irradiance, the wind that we had, whatever the resource is. And so it can be a real neat and clean way of measuring things, but when it comes to trying to do that inside of an O&M guarantee, it's the exclusions that are the killer.
Mm. And can you expand on that, where some of these exclusions have been carved out for you before, and where that may have hurt your ultimate performance?
Yeah, I can say in my experience, you know, I think there's two things that impact you there. One, probably the first thing, and again, I know this probably speaks more to time-based availability guarantees than anything else, but really is how far into the array are you able to measure? Early on in my experience in solar, whatever it was, 10, 12 years ago now, you know, it was, I mean, time-based was the only guarantee that was there, and you were only measuring that down to the inverter level. And so if you had any issues inside your array, it's impacting your ability to perform, but it's not actually impacting the contractual availability in that case. And so, over time, I think as Christine mentioned, are you able to monitor the trackers? Are you able to monitor the health of the DC assets, the modules, the combiner boxes, everything? If you can do that, it can be a very powerful way to look to measure those things. Other exclusions that can be problematic are sort of some of the nuances about downtime when if it is something where you have an O&M provider that was not the constructor or the EPC or the developer, that if there's a problem with an inverter that needs to be solved with warranty, well, how does that come in, and how much control are you as the owner giving to your O&M provider to be responsible and manage that warranty and deal with that problem for you? If you're not giving them that level of responsibility, it's hard for them to take on the risk with then being responsible for something that they had very little to do with. And so those are the sorts of things that I think you need to really think through and work through with your O&M provider to see what responsibility are they willing to take on. And if they're willing to take that on, I mean, obviously that will come at a cost of some description. But if they're willing to take that on, then are they willing to be accountable for the performance they're under?
And Christine, you had piped in a little bit. Do you have anything that you wanted to add to that?
Sorry, yeah, it was going back a little ways regarding the unavailability definition for energy based. On my comment of it being harder to administer, if there's more uncertainty in how it's calculated, how the loss energy might be calculated, then the level offered might be harder to have at a high level. So you might be able to only get to a 97 or 98% at a guarantee when you're offering liquidated damages if the calculation of that has more uncertainty involved. That doesn't mean it's a better or worse guarantee. It's just something to consider. Along the lines of what Ian was discussing regarding exclusions and really being careful with the provisions, one of the questions to ask when considering response time, say, is when does the clock start? Does it start when the issue is detected? Does it start when the issue started? Is the operator empowered to make decisions on their own? If they have a part in the truck, they can turn around and get it and fix it right away. Or do they need to wait for the owner to sign off on that work, which can then delay? And it's part of the exclusion, so it doesn't hurt their availability guarantee, but it's not the best interest for the owner. So understanding is what goes into, when does the clock start? How long does it go on for? What's the responsibilities of the operator? What's the responsibilities of the owner to get the project? It is in the best interest of the project to get it up to full health as soon as possible, keeping in mind costs for repair, of course.
Mm-hmm. And thank you for your clarifications on that. All right, so Bradley, back to you. How much of a premium do O&Ms charge to have a guarantee? Would a fixed fee contract pricing be significantly less without?
Yeah, unfortunately, but hopefully unsurprisingly, I think given everything we've talked about, I'm going to answer with it depends. There's so many variables we consider when we're pricing a guarantee that I can't tell anybody what the premium is. But I think generally, my experience on the customer side is somewhat limited, but I would say that most of the time that our customers think the cost is material and it's not negligible. Otherwise, everybody would sign up for a guarantee. So it is a material change to a fixed fee contract for sure.
Is there any way to actually determine what that could look like for every project across the board? Or do you think that the actual personalization of how you come up with these contract pricing is really dependent on the project itself?
I think it's very dependent. I'm sure there is progress we can make on our understanding and pricing as we offer more of these, and as we hopefully meet more of these, we can have a better understanding of the risk we're taking on. But I think in the same way that I'd love to be able to say yes, it's this premium, this is the scale, this is how it varies by region. I think that's just not the reality for how it works right now. This is the same with pricing O&M contracts generally, right? Projects vary. Like there's different regulations, different project designs. Things cost different amounts. So it's not the simplest thing in the world.
Maybe Teresa, if I can ask Bradley a related question, I'll take charge. But Bradley, maybe to that end, is there a difference in the cost if the guarantee can be reciprocal, meaning that there is a bonus and damages versus if there's damages only?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I certainly, again, I can't tell you what that would be, but definitely, like if there's potential for us to earn a bonus on a project, absolutely, we would the cost would be lower. But yeah.
And we don't see very many requests for that, but do you think though that with time and as we do understand more about this, that would be something that would, Christine, you could probably answer to this, could this become an industry standard where there could be a bonus structure for the operator if they're able to meet or exceed rather their guaranteed performance?
We do see it. It's typically rare. What it does, it is in the best interest of the project if it doesn't align incentives. So I could see it happening, but as Ian mentioned, if the project can retain the value that is created, you can see why the project might want to retain it. But I do see the value of energy-based availability guarantees, with them being more complicated, but potentially providing more upside to the owner and aligning incentives. Providers who are willing to offer them might be able to carve themselves out a bit of differentiation in the market. Like there has been so much race to the bottom in O&M over the last few years that it's kind of like you get what you pay for. The contracts have been optimized to a certain extent, and with lower cost service, you may get simpler to administer and less oversight and more exclusions. And if that's the choice that you're making and you can take asset management and more ownership in-house as an owner, maybe that's a choice that you want to make. But I do think that there are a lot of owners out there who want the O&M more, to have more of a full wrap O&M, and O&M providers who can provide that might be able to differentiate with that service.
And Bradley, can you elaborate on the best practices for incorporating response time requirements alongside availability guarantees?
I'm actually not sure that I can. I don't have a lot of experience on the response time portion of this. Where I'm normally involved is whether there is an availability of performance guarantee. But as I highlighted in my slides, one of the key elements of an availability guarantee is the response. So we can quantify that, and in some respects, again, I'm going to kind of say that it's incorporated within an availability guarantee. You're not going to achieve high availability if you don't respond in a certain time frame. So I don't know that I can speak to the best practices for incorporating those.
Would anybody else want to expand on that?
We might see a matrix. It's a bit about setting expectations. So we might see a matrix of X many of hours. If it's a full inverter outage, then somebody has to be on site. And this is when sites are not staffed. And it's more typical to have response times associated. And if there is, say, it's a combiner box level issue, then it can take this much time. If it's something lower, it's maybe repaired in this much time. And oftentimes with the response times, you'll have whether permission from the owner is required to make those repairs. It's giving a tier of response and service with the severity of the event for expectation management.
And that makes sense, right? Because we can't treat every single issue as if it's severe, you know, sure. There's some things that you need to kind of investigate, find out a little bit more to then be able to respond in a reasonable time and with proper equipment. So when we compare module versus like inverter warranties, for instance, is it easier to get RMA on an inverter warranty as compared to warranty on modules? Christine, do you have any feedback on that, or anybody? Yeah.
I'm actually not sure what RMA means in this instance. I'm gonna.
I'll revert to Ian then. Is this something you might be able to answer for our audience?
I was going to ask the same question. So,
I can jump in. So
Sure.
RMA is return merchandise authorization. So I don't know that it applies to modules. It definitely applies to string inverters. So it's the process whereby we identify a failed inverter, we're in communication with the OEM, and they authorize us to return the inverter, and they will ship us a new one. And so I think I presented a little on that in my slides, and really the key there is there's a delay associated with that process. It takes time to beyond diagnosing and getting approval. The inverter goes back. Hopefully the OEM sends a new one in its place, and it's not waiting for the return. But that's where a spare part comes in handy. You know, if you've got 1 or 2 string inverters available, you go and put that on site. You've only had maybe a day of outage, and then, you know, over the next week, you get the other inverter back, it goes into stock, and you're ready to go next time there's a problem. But I would say certainly it's more straightforward with an inverter manufacturer because it's usually clearer what's happening. Module warranty claims can be more complicated, usually requiring a lot more analysis, a lot more data gathering, and presenting that to the customer. It's also probably easier to communicate that the maintenance requirements were met for an inverter than for modules. But yeah, I would say it's definitely easier on the inverter level.
So to add to on that, because you know spare parts has been all three of you have mentioned the importance of having that incorporated into your contracts, and so who should be responsible for the spare parts? Is it something that the owner should be managing their own inventory, or should the O&M provider have, you know, a storage facility for these spare parts? What would be most reasonable?
So our approach generally is, ideally, I think I would want to try and come to some agreement with the O&M provider what spare parts are important, and then we'll make sure that we have a seed stock. I will say that as an owner, I want the O&M provider to then be responsible for managing the inventory. And I will add in, you know, and I know, I can't remember if it was Bradley or Christine, but someone talked about I think it was Bradley, talked about the availability of spare parts from inverters that are no longer manufactured, or inverter manufacturers that have gone out of business, those sorts of things. My preference is to have, you know, the responsibility for monitoring those sorts of things, the health of the supply chain, fall to the O&M provider, because they are the ones that are closest to it. They're dealing with it all the time. But that can be, I guess in my experience, that's been a sticky subject, because especially if it's a case where, you know, they weren't part of the development or construction, and so they're being handed, you know, a basket of parts that in a site with inverters that they weren't necessarily responsible for choosing, that you're now trying to get them to form a relationship with that provider to know what is the health of that company and supply chain. And if you can't get them from, you know, supplier one, what is your plan B or plan C? What are the backups for that? But again, at the end of the day, my hope is that, you know, working with larger O&M providers, that they have a lot of relationships with a lot of those different manufacturers already, and it's easier for them to know that and manage it. And then the expectation is that they come back to us as the owner to say, look, your inverter, you know, we are struggling to get spare parts. Now is the time to start boosting what is the right level of inventory to be able to carry you for a certain amount of time.
I wonder whether that reflects a little on the industry as well. It's maturing. There are a lot of changes. There are a lot of new products year over year. And I'm not sure how well all the manufacturers are stocking parts. I mean, I'm sure it varies across the manufacturers, but there are challenges there beyond just the O&M provider, I think.
Well, it sounds like it too, because, we've also seen some companies, manufacturers go out of business. And so how do we deal with the challenges of that, is sometimes that's not within the O&M's expectations, obviously, because they have their contractual obligations to honor. But if parts aren't available or the initial manufacturer is just no longer in business, then how do we reach, an agreement in that situation? Yeah. So since we collect data at inverter levels for all projects, it makes it easy to quantify and detect an underperforming inverter. So is the unavailability of data collection at panel level that restricts to detect early degradation and claim for warranty as soon as it deviates from its performance warranty? Sorry, this is a question from the audience, so I'm not entirely sure who of you might want to answer this. It seems like Bradley, you might be, this might be a good one for you.
I can take a first shot. I think I would actually challenge a little bit of that. I don't know that it's easy to quantify and detect an underperforming inverter. I said sometimes it is. Sometimes it's clear, but it's not always clear. And I think there's also, while we might have the technology to do that, we often get a lot of false positives on that. So while we can do it, it's not always the case. And so I think that goes back a little bit to how long does it take and which staff member is able to identify that there is a problem that requires a truck roll, or to decide that it's a false positive and it's not something we need to address. So the second part of the question is, sorry, I'm just looking at it now. The availability of data collection at panel level that restricts to detect early degradation. I'm not 100% sure where that's going, but I've seen different levels of data gathering over my career, and there have been periods where there's been a lot of data gathered at string level. That was at one point something that was very, very popular. String inverters often gave us that resolution, which was really valuable. There are inverters that give you module by module insights. I'm guessing that it certainly limits that. There is a cost associated with gathering that data and also analyzing that data. There's maybe the next question is going to delve into that a little bit, but presumably there's some modern techniques that will enable the analysis of that data and for us to identify these things more quickly, maybe in conjunction with the aerial thermal inspections. Like that data, the resolution and the granularity we have there is really valuable. But happy to turn that over to anybody else who might have some insights.
Unfortunately, we've actually run out of time. This has been just such an insightful conversation. I know I don't want it to end either, but I want to give a big thank you to our panelists, Bradley, Ian, and Christine, for answering these questions and for participating in this great presentation. It was a pleasure to have you with us today. And thank you to our audience for investing this time with us. We hope that you enjoyed this conversation and that it was of value to you. If you liked what you learned, don't hesitate to visit our website to get in contact with Borrego O&M or reach out to your own O&M provider to see what will be best for your needs. This concludes the webinar. Stay tuned for future webinars that we have and check out the website when we feature great blog posts. Thank you, everyone.